Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists. They did. They absolutely got it right. And tell you what, Sam Adams nailed it. And he didn't mince words with a whole lot of people when they really, really deserved to become or to be made mincemeat. Boy, I'll tell you, I keep going through again and again his writings. He made mincemeat out of those that deserved it. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today because there is so much going on. This whole insanity with H.R. 5 that the Democrats in the House passed. There's a like bill that has been put forward in Ohio. And what we're seeing is that you're getting this less than 1% of the dog's tail wagging the dog, okay? And that means that the whole area that is in this the acronym, the LGBT, whatever, trans this, trans that, and it's not trans-Pacific, transatlantic, and transcontinental, has everything to do with human behavior and sexuality. So I started looking at a number of different things, and I was going to go down all these other routes. As you know, that I usually have a multitude of routes that I may take. But what became extremely interesting to me is that many of you know that I am on the Mental Health Board and Recovery Services for our county. So I'm on that board, the board of directors for that. It's a bureaucracy, okay? And it is a bureaucracy established legislatively because, quite frankly, the churches don't do their job. They've taken and obviated everything over to the humanistic machines that are now operating within the context of government. So I wanted to, in the promo, I titled it Mental Health and Moral Issues, or Mental Health is a Moral Issue. And the reason I did that was, again, going back to the mirrors of history, going back to what our founders have established, they established for us, and that we have allowed that men and women who have no reference to the fundamental beliefs and beginning of this nation are now directing it morally. I had a conversation with someone today, and hopefully I'm going to have that person on as a guest in a couple weeks. One of the things that we were talking about is how, following founders' fundamentals, morality is something that is legislated, flat out. Or what we're seeing today and what we saw creep in, and I want to bring out some of the words of Sam Adams throughout the course of this program, is what we see that creeps in, and he uses that. What creeps in is immorality. And with immorality becomes tyranny. So what we're seeing very, very clearly by virtue of this H.R. 6, by virtue of these civil rights so-called acts or movements or civil rights demands for a less than 1% of the dog's tail, what we're seeing in the context of all of that is that our foundational belief system, which was developed and just brought together by biblical Reformation thinking and understanding of not just a person, who and what a person is in the image of God, but also what it means to take and make our constitutional republic something that is a hair wire, a hair wire, which means that that strand of hair wire just goes and snaps. So that's what we have. That's what we have as a problem. And in referring to that, and this is systemic in all of the mental health boards across the state of Ohio, and I don't know what it's like in a lot of the other states, but for sure in the state of Ohio, you have to go through a budget process in which then you invite all these different agencies to come in and pitch why we should give them taxpayers' money. And in doing that, what I'm continuously seeing, and I'm going to segue here, and what we saw also when Adam Reddick was on the program, and what's impacting our children with the social emotional learning and education, especially since the 60s, and if not before that, as I've talked about in other programs relative to education, what we have seen and what we're seeing even more so is taking and eliminating any idea of God within the context of education. When you take God out of education and what social emotional learning and H.R. 6 and this other House bill in Ohio, which I'll reference in a little bit because I'm not that interested in it in the moment, when you reference that all together, it not only takes God out of education and promotes evil, and that's what it all is, and I'll talk about that because it's between morality, which means you quantify and define what is right and what is wrong. And the only place to develop that is in the context of, do you believe, as our founders believed, in a God? And some of them may have been deist, but they believed that there was an authority that was greater and higher than mankind. And that's a problem today. Most people don't believe that. I'll tell you, the majority of people on the mental health boards don't believe that, even at the state level. And if they do believe it, if there's that minority in there, like myself, that do believe it, then what happens is that they capitulate to state regulations and they capitulate to the humanist ideas of how to do therapy. We have to do therapy. We have to do counseling. And I'm not making fun of that because there are people that need help. But in listening over and over and over again to every one of the issues, every one of the programs, every one of the agencies that I have been sitting and listening to speak for over a year now that I've been on this board, I always come back, I come home, and I look at Kathy and I say, we have a moral problem. Mental health is not fixable by human thought process. Are there things that can maybe guide some people? Yeah. And are there things that are out there for people who detest God? Well, they're not going to work through the processes anyway, because even with some of the human intervention that's going on requires that people look at something outside themselves. But when someone and gets so locked into themselves, they can't see beyond that. And it becomes questionable in my opinion. So maybe there's some of you out there, and I use sew a lot because, we have to sew things together, if you will, from one end to the other and bring that fabric together. So the sewing could be of two references. One of sewing those things together, or one of planting those seeds to see what will grow. In this case, we're trying to knit. I won't use knit because I can't knit. But what we're trying to do is put the various things together. So some people were asking, and as we're getting close to the end of this first segment, well, Tom, what qualifies you to talk about mental health and, all of that type of stuff? Well, one of my degrees is in behavioral science, and I have done counseling in the past. And so I have a framework on what that is all about. I know, and from what I've seen, people that I've interacted with, and I'm going to talk about in the third segment what I believe is a very fruitful process in speaking about these mental health issues that are really moral issues. Everything that I hear from child abuse, spousal abuse, uh, depressions, a drug abuse, on and on and on and on it goes, that I sit here and I look at it and I go, I would say that over 90% of all of those various items are the moral issues of taking out the basic fundamentals of God from the classroom. Some people say, oh, with all these school shootings and everything, we have to, get in there because all the kids are mentally ill and we have to do this and all this emotional stuff and bullying and everything like that. Well, when we do not teach our children what it means to be made in the image of God, when we do not teach our children what the fundamentals are within the Ten Commandments, if nothing else, especially in those commandments that are pointed towards humans living in society, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, so on and so forth, you sit there and you go, well, where's the framework? Because the framework of what is being taught now is destructive and has been destructive, especially destructive as we saw the Ten Commandments and that taken out in the 60s. So as I think about this and I want to consider all that we have to talk about today, I wanted to open up with that in my judgment, yes, a judgment, and my opinion, yes, you think I'm opinionated? And with the statistical facts that are out there, I have to clearly identify that the majority of what's going on is, yeah, a moral issue. Yes, it is. It's very much so. And once again, I'm sorry, I will say this, but the majority of the churches just have walked away. You talk about a walkaway movement. For the last 40 years in particular, we have had a massive walkaway movement by Christians that should be standing up. As Sam Adams, and we get into the next segment, challenged a Christian for taking and capitulating at that time and discussing what is morality in governance. What does it mean to have moral law? And we are going to talk about my favorite Scotsman, my most favorite Scotsman in America who immigrated to America ever, John Witherspoon. And we're going to talk about what he has to say on morality, because remember, John Witherspoon, if you go to the chaplains and clergy of the Revolution, John Witherspoon not only was a pastor, a university president, a theologian, a university president, I know, get my diction right, but he was also involved in politics. He was a peer with Sam Adams on many of the same committees as Sam Adams. They became good friends. And they resonated from that biblical Reformation perspective on what is good government that begins with self-government. Begins with self-government. And we don't teach that anymore. We don't teach what it means to self-govern. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to go to samueladamsreturns.net and sign up for the promos if you're not getting them. And the next thing is that you come back for the second and then the third segment here when Sam Adam returns, And those anti-federalists, they got it right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they did. They absolutely got it right, and they were so predictive. I wanted to encourage you once again to tune in to other programming here at Liberty Works Radio Network, and then also my program is at Dr. Mike Spalding's program that he has on Saturdays down there in Lima, Ohio. So check that out. But most of all, I would like you to take and go to samueladamsreturns.net, where you can find the archives. You can find the two books that I'm pointing to here in the video, as well as you can sign up to get the newsletters or anything else that I put up new at the time. And I'd really appreciate that. And let others know about this, and let them know that they can find the podcast at Blueberry, as well as they can find it at Google, as well as they can find it at I think that's at iTunes. So there's several different places, and I'd really appreciate that you'd get the word out. We're trying to, build the following. And one of the things that's important for you to know, I always ask you to take and participate with Liberty Works Radio Network, because it is a listener funded, it is a listener funded network. I don't ask you to do anything with Sam Adams in contributing, because the best way that you can do anything for the Samuel Adams Returns is to buy the books. Buy the books. I don't have a lot of stuff up there or out there, but it's nice to know that this is meaningful to folks. So with you signing up for a newsletter, for you taking and listening to the podcast, and signing up for the podcast at either iTunes, Blueberry, or Google, and all of that is at the end of the video that you can watch on YouTube, which also is again at samueladamsreturns.net. So I needed to promo what we're doing here a little bit more, and seeing that that information is getting out becomes useful, and that you can get that out to others. So in the first segment, I was talking about mental health and morality. So I know I'm using that sewing again. The important aspect of all of that is God created us in a certain way. And anytime that a man thinks he's a woman, that isn't a mental disorder. That is a judgment. That is a decision. That is a confusion that is caused by immorality. Look, it's throughout the whole Bible. It's all throughout the Old Testament. And one of the grossest managements or discussions around that is what happened with Sodom and Gomorrah. So where do you think you get the term sodomy from? There you go. And then how does that fit in law? So we mentioned the whole thing about the federal HR 5, I think is what it is, that, we have the 1% of the dog's tail wagging a whole nation. I just found for you the Ohio legislation there's SB, Senate Bill 11, that's going to require 114-page document that will require biological men be allowed in women's restrooms, locker rooms, and showers if they claim to identify as a woman. Requires boys be allowed to play in girls' sports in public schools if they claim to identify as a woman. Force women's homeless shelters and domestic violence shelters to allow biological men who claim to identify as a woman to bathe and bunk with women. Allow state government to remove children from parent custody who do not consent to dangerous conversion hormone therapy. So you can have your kid taken away if you're saying no to the hormone therapy. force doctors to participate in gender transition surgeries and procedures, require businesses to participate in same-sex weddings even if the wedding violates their religious beliefs. Folks, it's not a mental health thing. It's not anything other than the tail wagging the dog. And in this case, it is the less than 1% of the hairs in the tail wagging the dog. A couple of things that we have to look at that our founders talked about was just the whole idea of natural law. There's so many people that talk about natural law, and there's many Christians that argue it from one side or the other. You know what? We can do that till the sun doesn't shine, the moon forgets to rise, and there's going to be as many opinions as there are anatomies. But the founders understood this from a perspective that if we don't take into account the fundamentals of natural law being God's idea of law, then tyranny comes upon us. And that's what we have with all of this different legislation is tyranny. So we go through here in an article that I'm including, or has been included, I should say. It's in the website as well as the archives and from the promo. Canada Free Press. This was back, looking at the date, actually was in March of 2011. Can U.S. founders' natural law help defeat Obama's socialist change? Talks about a number of different things at the beginning of the article, but then it moves into natural law founders and refuge from tyranny. In the perpetual roots of natural law, you can debate it, as I already said. It's a time-honored undertaking. Natural law is always will be something for ethically minded thinkers. And that's why we don't hear a lot about natural law in the philosophy classes at university, and that the Democrat and socialist and liberal and even libertarians don't necessarily talk about natural law. There's a couple basic schools of thought represented by Aquinas versus Hobbs. Aquinas believed law was tied into an understanding of God and his standards to be worked out by man and society. Whereas the atheist Hobbes believed the state creates and justifies its own laws without reference to any outside standard. And that's the battle still going on with our foundation today. And that it is God over man and the universe? Did God create it? Or is it from the state? Is it just some kind of mind game that's played out there that people just come up with a wild hair picture of and say, oh, this is the way it needs to be? Well, I would say read this article because there's many things under it and in it that I'm not going to try and compress in the next 8 minutes, 6.5 minutes. But some of the things that I would like to press in on is a rational definition of natural law, which the founders took into consideration. As the legal commentator, the British legal commentator William Blackstone, was the largest influencer of the principles upon the founders. And you heard in a program recently that next to the Bible in America, Blackstone's commentaries were the next form of book that was even in people's homes. That's why you heard it from General Gage that the Americans are smatterers in the law, because people were interested in understanding that fundamental of what did the Bible say, first and foremost, and then secondly, how did Blackstone look at that across the whole idea of the loosely defined British Constitution? So I have 5 minutes left and I got to quit sewing and bring it home for you. Natural law has a divine element according to Blackstone. So this is what the founders understood, a divine element by someone who wrote the greatest commentary on the English legal system and constitutional system of the day. So when the supreme being formed, and this is from Blackstone, when the supreme being formed the universe and created matter out of nothing, he impressed certain principles upon that matter, from which it can never depart, and without which it would cease to be. This law of nature, being coeval with mankind and dictated by God himself, is of course superior in obligation to any other. It is binding over all the globe, in all countries, at all times. No human laws are in validity if contrary to this, and such of them as are valid deserve all the force and all authority immediately or immediately from this origin. Upon these two foundations, the law of nature and the law of revelation, being the Bible, depend all human laws. That is to say, no human laws should be suffered to contradict these. So our Congress, and especially the Democrats in particular, and I don't care whether it's in local government, state government, or at the national level, but any of those that are contrary to these two fundamental principles of natural law as defined by Blackstone are not law. They're not law because they go against the principles, the biblical principles of God, and they go against what was not just his natural law, what he placed into nature. You know, Jesus says that if people didn't worship him, the rocks would cry out and worship. So as much as there are a number of different things with Aquinas that I don't always agree with, he did some great work around this, and I thought it was pretty interesting to look at what Aquinas had to say, and we should, when it comes to the ideas of natural law. The implementation of it and some of the other aspects of what he had to say, don't always agree with. But Blackstone and Locke even talk about defending that natural law defends individual rights of life, liberty, and property. That's where they got it for the Declaration of Independence, was understanding these three primary personal rights. Personal security, the right consists in a person's legal and uninterrupted enjoyment of his life, his limbs, his body, his health, and his reputation. Personal liberty consists in the power of locomotion, of changing situations, or removing one's person to whatever place one owns or is inclined may be directed. Ladies and gentlemen, this takes the whole context of the legal system's argument and the Democrats' argument about abortion. What is a human is defined already in the law of nature. So that's one piece. And what is a woman and what is a man is defined in the very beginning within the context of Genesis. It's not a mental disorder, you see. It's not a mental disorder with all this transgender stuff, with all of the LGBT stuff. No, it's simply lust. It's simply taking and defying the creator of the universe. It's simply taking and being turned over to their sin. Oh, sin. We can't talk about that, can we? Well, we should. And so should the churches. Many of the evangelical churches don't talk about sin in the context that even remotely touches on what Blackstone or what we have here in natural law. We can argue it again until the cows come home, but guess what? Our founders understood it very, very clearly. And that was the context upon which they built the foundation of America. And Sam Adams, being the last Puritan, understood it without any question. So when we come back, Samuel Adams is returning, and those anti-federalists, they did. They absolutely got it right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third and final segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they got it right. This is Tom Navolis, your host. I think throughout the first and second segments, I even forgot to introduce myself. Didn't I, Kath? She's going, yeah, I forgot to introduce myself. Well, if you're here, you know who I am. If not, you know, you see it in the host page at Liberty Works Radio Network. You see it there at SamuelAdamsReturns.net. And yes, you get to see my smiling face on YouTube at the Samuel Adams Returns channel. So you get a lot of opportunity to really know who this guy is. So with that, I wanted to continue just a little bit more from the last segment in this article from 2011 in the Canada Free Press. I like those guys. So we are hearing, and I love that so, because we're knitting it together. And we're not knitting, we're sewing it together. And sewing it together, what we're finding here, and Kathy's laughing at me because she's a knitter and a crocheter. I can crochet and do my socks. Anyway, you don't need to know all of that. What you want to know is what in the world is going on in California that they're taking pictures out of Washington because they're offensive. The founder of our nation is offensive, so you got to take that out. And guess what? It's Thomas Jefferson, who all the Christians out there are saying he's a deist. Okay, whatever. But he's being attacked even by the liberals. He's being attacked in such a manner that Thomas Jefferson, that slave owner, okay, he's being attacked. Yet, Thomas Jefferson was able to take all that this young man at the time that he was able to compile everything that was happening from his youth and what he heard from the men, what he read, and what he understood from the foundational truths that we just talked about from Blackstone. You know, there's people that became Christians just by reading Blackstone. Yeah, I'm not going to get off into those. But Thomas Jefferson, who then wrote the Declaration of Independence, gave us the right to resist tyrants. The resistance movement that's going on today by the Democrats, the socialists, is not the same that Thomas Jefferson was talking about. The resistance movement that's going on today by the Democrats and all of the others associated with them is strictly a Marxist, Leninist, Trotsky resistance. It is building that whole environment of communism and jihadism to take down this country, to take down and enslave you and I, and because of the jihadist component in it, and that relationship between the communists and the jihadists is they're out to kill us. That's just the simplest thing to say. But in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson puts this together from this quote that he made too. And this is a quote also that Ben Franklin has made. Resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. And the resistance to tyrants that we're talking about here is that resistance that is from a godly measure, not from the Hobbs side of the thought process of government and Marxism and all of that. And I want to get off of this pretty quickly because I want to finish up with the morality and mental health, because that's what we're really talking about. But what Jefferson was saying here, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God, being the God of the Bible, entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impelled them to the separation. It's not about what these communists, socialists, jihadists are doing, but it's what is biblically correct. So I'm not going to continue on. You can read the Declaration of Independence as we're coming up into that 4th of July time frame. So, sewing it together. Yes, I know. I always catch myself. People say different things. Kathy has this whole line of what all different people say, and I'm like, but I say so a lot. And it's amazing. And I catch myself doing that when we go through to develop and render these programs down. It's always amazing to me. So, but my friend, I call him my friend because when I get into this character of Samuel Adams, he would be my friend. John Witherspoon, great mind, great philosopher, great teacher. And he has, which I've talked about before in some of my past programs, is lectures on moral society. Lectures on moral society. Phenomenal. In estimating the morality of actions, several circumstances must be considered. 1, the good done. 2, the principle from which it flows, self-interest of the contracted kind, benevolence, or hope of reward. 3, the hindrance or opposition that must be surmounted as interest, inclination, and difficulty. An objection seems to arise from this, not easily solved. If an action is the more virtuous, the more opposition. Get that? If it's more virtuous, you're going to get more opposition. I wonder what that is. Oh, it's called sin and immorality. So you get more opposition, and it's from internal opposition and external that is to be overcome. It has to be overcome. Then the longer man has had the habit of virtue, and the more completely it is formed, the less merit in his actions. Oh my. Hey, you guys out there that want to put your thumbs in your suspenders, you can see on the camera, I got my thumbs in my suspenders. If you're going to be virtuous, if you're going to be wise, and you could go look at Ecclesiastes 7, and chapter 7 in there, and it talks about that wisdom. And you're not very wise if you take and you have to put your thumbs out there and promote it and promote yourself, because it says we're all sinners, that not a human that breeds upon this earth or has transitioned through time that has not, while in their life, been a sinner. It seems also to take away all moral excellence from the deity. Wow. So when you're sticking your thumb in your suspenders and you're out there, fluffing out your feathers, what you're doing is you're taking away the work that God has designed you to do. Morality. Who cannot be supposed to have the least opposition to encounter either from within or without. This objection cannot be easily removed but by saying that the opposition is no other respect in evidence of good moral temper. But as it shows, the strength of the inclination that overcomes it, and therefore, when a moral habit is so strong as to overcome and annihilate all opposition, it is so much the more excellent. He goes on talking about human nature and the phenomena of that. And I take this because this is what Sam Adams and the Anti-Federalists talk about. And you so often hear me say that the Federalists expected the churches to do their job. And this is where we're going to wrap it and tie it or sew it all back together on mental health and that it's really a moral issue. Is that the churches, the Federalists expected, would do their job so we would always have a virtuous and moral people. And by definition of virtuous and moral people, it comes under the philosophical basis that Witherspoon is talking about in what is a moral society. The Anti-Federalists, to that extent, in which also we have here with Witherspoon, goes on to say that, nope, guess what? Humankind, we have selfish schemes, usually resolved for self-interest. We have all of these other aspects. We have deceit, we have lying, we have lust, we have greed. We have all of these other ideas of human nature that come into what could be perceived as public virtue. Now, just think about it. How virtuous is the Clinton Foundation for going out there and helping all those poor people in Haiti? Just think about that. Now, isn't that wonderful? Look at about all of the millions of dollars that they have contributed to the poor in taking care of those in need. Well, I don't think you get it. I don't have to explain it. The mental health component is the same thing. Follow the money. Follow the fact and the reality that what Witherspoon said here, that when we're looking at all of this puffing up, all of this thumbs in your suspenders, that it takes away all moral excellence from God. That's it, right there. So when education takes God out of there, how do you quantify, how do you qualify what is moral excellence and personal and public virtue? How do you define that? How do you bring that into some semblance? Well, we have to have this program that goes in there to help these kids because they're emotionally disturbed, and we have to bring them into this same minion emotional monster. So then that we have that society accepts all of these various deviations to the extent then that we emotionally mold these children and tell them all the way through what is tolerable or not. And when we do that, then we can take and have a perfect society according to Hobbs and Marx. Really? Think about it. No. It's not going to be ever a perfect society. The only way that we can have a society that has any semblance of justice, any semblance of what is meaningful. And I'm not going to be able to get into all of what Sam Adams wrote. They are in the notes. They're at samueladamsreturns.net. Go to today's program and you'll be able to see in the notes where he talks about the same thing before Jefferson wrote it, and even after Jefferson wrote it, that if you have immorality, it leads to tyranny, and tyranny leads to slavery within the context of that despotism, and that's what was happening within the colonies. So what do I need you to do? If you live in Ohio, the majority of the counties have a mental health and recovery services board. You need to go take a look at it. Go to the meetings. Their monthly meetings are public meetings. Find out when they are. Listen to what's happening there. Listen to how your county dollars are being spent, how your Medicaid dollars are being spent. Check out who the agencies are. Just go to their website and see where their services are. And more importantly, what you need to do is start going back to your pastors and your churches, your deacons, your elders, and saying, why are we taking and doing this and letting it all go to humanist instead of God's word? What I worked with, mostly with other military members, is that if someone was suffering from some kind of PSTD issue, the best place to go is to the book of Psalms. Every human emotion, every trial, tribulation, every sin that you can think of is all walked out. Not only that, it takes you to the whole idea of how to praise, worship, and glorify the living God that created you. And that's really, if you have mental distress, that's really where to go, is to the book of Psalms. I go there a lot. And it's true. It works. And Sam Adams understood that because you can see how he weaves Scripture into his writings. So come on back next week when Sam Adams, that last Puritan, returns, and we know that the Anti-Federalists, they got it right.